From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
Desperate times call for desperate measures. It's mid-August as I'm speaking to you, usually the time of year that I'd load the family up in an airplane and fly off somewhere over an ocean for a summer vacation. Not this year. My wife and I looked at the map, figured out where we could go on four wheels. Loading the kids, dog, and hamster into the SUV, we vectored east from the Catskills. Destination, Newport, Rhode Island. Now, the topography was much the same as I'd left it last as a strapping young lad in 1983. Bannister's Wharf, the Clark Cookhouse, the Black Pearl restaurant as anchors were right where I left it. So is One Pelham East in its perch overlooking Thames Street and America's Cup Avenue. Oh, the America's Cup. 37 years since 1983 doesn't dull the pain. I'm not much of a sailor, but I'm a huge sailing fan, and my memories of watching Dennis Conner in the United States lose the sport's ultimate prize after holding it for 132 years, 4 races to 3, after being up 3-1 to a wing keel 12-meter skippered by John Bertrand out of Australia's Royal Perth Yacht Club, is still one of the best David and Goliath stories of modern sports. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister of Australia back then. When that 7th race was televised down under just before dawn on September 27th, 1983, celebrations broke out across the country. Hawke was asked if he would declare the day a national holiday just to let the hangovers subside. Actually, the Prime Minister didn't have that power, but he said it should be, and said that any state premiers who disagreed with him might, as I quote Mr. Hawke, find themselves in a spot of bother, adding that any boss who sacks a worker for not turning up today is a bum. A bum indeed. Americans got a full dose of the Australian ethos and psyche that summer and fall, and Australia's influence on this country only grew from there. In different decades since, our screens have been lit up by Russell Crowe, Nicole Kidman, Hugh Jackman, Margot Robbie, and Chris Hemsworth. And even this year, I've been glued to the portrayals by 2 Australian actors, Cate Blanchett and Rose Byrne, playing American icons Phyllis Schlafly and Gloria Steinem in Mrs. America on Hulu. So what is it about this country of 25 million people spread across 3 million square miles, best accessible from New York by a flight of almost 22 hours, that so captivates us? We'll find out in a conversation with Alastair Walton, Australia's man in New York, about the intertwined U.S.-Australian relationship, navigating the complexity in election year, and whether the Consul-General could indeed declare a national holiday if Jason Day or Adam Scott can win their second major. That's all right after this.
The growth of Brent crude is the story of a global benchmark. It's the story of managing risk as market dynamics, technology, and economies evolve. And it's the story of Intercontinental Exchange. Oil was largely considered a landlocked commodity until Brent was discovered and extracted from the North Sea floor in the 1970s. As production became commercialized, market participants needed protection against price moves. In response, the Brent futures contract was developed by the oil industry in the 1980s. Brent quickly became the global price benchmark for crude oil as a waterborne supply easily transported across trade routes, and is the basis for refined products such as diesel and jet fuel.
In 2001, when ICE first acquired the International Petroleum Exchange, the Brent contract had just begun its ascent towards being recognized as a global benchmark. We worked with the industry to shift towards electronic trading, and it transformed the market, boosting transparency and market access. We've worked closely with our customers to manage their oil price risk across global markets. We serve a wide range of customers, from commercial users and producers to financial players.
With over 20 plus consecutive years of record volume, ICE Futures Europe is the world's leading global oil exchange. 2/3 of the world's oil is priced relative to Brent, providing security and liquidity to the global market. And at ICE, we're helping customers navigate global oil markets.
Our guest today, Alastair J.M. Walton, is the Consul-General of Australia to New York. It's a position he's held since 2017, when he moved north from Houston, serving as Consul-General and Senior Trade Commissioner there. Before taking up a government post, Alastair was an investment banker, serving as chairman of BKK Partners, co-chair and managing director of Goldman Sachs Australia, and managing director and head of investment banking for Credit Suisse in the region. He got his MBA from Columbia and was lieutenant in the Royal Australian Army Reserve. Welcome, Alastair, inside the Ice House.
Thank you so much, Josh, and it's a real honour to be interviewed by you. This is actually my last week as Consul General, so it's a great time to reflect on the American-Australian relationship and the role that we play here.
Well, as it is a swan song, Alastair, let's go back to the beginning of the tune, where I sort of made a bookmark anyway. Where were you when John Bertrand in Australia too took the America's Cup?
I was back in Australia, and I think I had a hangover as well.
Talk to me about the job in a non-COVID world and how that changes amid a pandemic. Certainly a lot fewer passengers on those 22-hour flights between New York and Sydney.
Yeah, so I guess the Consul General has really two distinct roles, and one relates to consular work, in which we are open, and the other to public diplomacy. So in a formal sense, I'm accredited by the US Department of State to represent Australia's interests and the welfare of our citizens in my jurisdictional area. So we're headquartered in New York, but we actually have 10 states and 2 territories within our jurisdiction. These represent about a quarter of the United States GDP, so they're very large. And as a result, we're one of the largest issuers of Australian passports. We provide consular assistance to people in distress. We even manage sensitive issues such as Australians in prisons and also helping families who have lost ones. The other thing is, in any week, we probably have 150 Australians or more calling up about their passports, travel advisories, quarantine, and these are regularly changing, as you know. So we're constantly having to be the source of truth for the citizens. Fortunately, now I've had COVID. I should mention my fiancée Berry's had COVID. Many of our staff have had COVID, but there's been no Australians that have actually died from COVID here. But you mentioned about being open. The US State Department has said that we're deemed an essential service. So our consulate has been open for Australians to come in to help with passports and other services. So that's something I'm really proud of. The fact that within there was 2 days when we thought it was too risky in terms of the operating environment, but by and large we've remained open. We're open today. Now that's on the consular side, but the other role where you have a lot more discretion is public diplomacy. And in a way, I'm also the Australian ambassador to Wall Street, informally in the financial market. So I deal with a lot of investment banks and institutional fund managers here, as well as many pension funds visiting New York. So in a sense, we've been really impacted. The public diplomacy side has been very badly impacted by COVID in terms of meeting people, but our consular services remain open. And I think, frankly, that's become more and more important to citizens, knowing there's actually someone that can get a problem resolved.
Now, you mentioned the consulate has both a political and government vertical. Isn't that normally the role of the Australian embassy in Washington, D.C.? So what do you do in this area that's different from what the embassy does a couple hundred miles south?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it's an initiative I brought into the post. So after 2.5 years, and probably way too late, I sort of recognise that our embassy in DC does really heavy lifting with the White House, the Congress, State departments, federal agencies, but with a major gap in terms of contact with governors and state governments. And when I was in Texas, I had a very warm relationship with Governor Greg Abbott. And when I was here, I felt that this sort of political and governance interface was missing. So I wrote a brief back to the department in Canberra and saying, look, I think we should restructure to bring this in and get rid of another position. and it was approved within 24 hours, which has to be a world record for any department around the world. So thank you for DFAT. But really, I should have done it in my first 6 months. I filled the position with this great guy called Luke Phillips just at the end of February. So of course, this was just in time for COVID. And what I would say, this is a great example of good luck rather than good management, because, New York became the epicenter of the pandemic, and all of a sudden we're writing reports back every day about what was going on from political and government section back to Canberra. And we started really with the medical side, impact on first responders, hospitals, etc. But gradually we incorporated the effects of the US economy as a whole as we started to see the impact of lockdown. And then really what was happening politically on a state-by-state basis. So leading up to the November elections, we're getting to the sharp end of this, and the US is simply too big a country with too many diverse interests just to be analysed out of Washington. It's very helpful to be on the ground to speak to people. We even reach out to donors to see what they're thinking.
Alastair, a couple Aussies work on our team. Others work at the New York Stock Exchange. They are our colleagues. Every one of us who's lived in New York, Washington, Boston, anywhere in the United States has friends that they have loved who bring the Aussie spirit up to the United States. And yet, given you read the same press that I do, Alastair, this country has a big COVID-19 problem. Wonder, what you see as the future and the future ramifications of the expat community here from COVID-19, and whether the United States still seems that, great place to either spend part of your life to or emigrate to.
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's work in progress and everyone's different. So let's start with the Australians that have lived in New York for most of their working lives, and to which New York is home. And a good example of this is my Columbia Business School classmate, James Gorman, who's the CEO and chairman of Morgan Stanley. Sure. So James obviously remain in the city no matter what happens. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's young entrepreneurs and small business owners, maybe cafes or restaurants, who've only been here in New York a few years. They're building up their profile and their financial situation, but they've been really economically knocked around, devastated by this pandemic. And so you have them. And then also you have families with children who are not sure about long-term schooling here, particularly private versus public, etc., and where they should return home. So it's really been disruptive not only to Americans, which it has been, but also about the Australians here, and also particularly those, I think, in the performing and visual arts space. They have very significant uncertainties when they can return. I mean, Broadway's now closed until the end of the year. And, a young person in those industries has a shorter life expectancy in terms of what they can do than, say, somebody maybe in a normal corporate life. So I think the jury's out as to long-term implications of the broader Australian community here. But I'm cautiously optimistic as the state and city continues to reopen. I welcome the news on museums, for example. I think they're going to continue to make a vibrant and dynamic contribution to the economy. And this will always be a magnet for talented Australians.
Paint a picture for me in the pre-COVID world of the types of events that you would get involved in and would host at the consulate. You've now had to pivot completely, turning to webinars and social media to engage in your stakeholders. Who are these events designed to bring together now, and what have you lost compared to what it was, say, a year ago?
There's a lot of discussion, as going on about the future of the workplace and platforms such as this. But I'm kind of old-fashioned about this. I think you can maintain a relationship virtually, but I think you can't build one. That's my personal view. And certainly as a diplomat, it's very, very difficult. So I've actually found that my interaction with, business, cultural and community leaders has certainly suffered since March. There's a lot less spontaneity, I think, in the virtual workplace. And it's a less creative environment to bring people together. Now, look, we've had to adapt, just as you have. We're using Zoom, WebEx, Teams, but they're nothing like as effective as face-to-face meetings. And we've obviously ramped up our social media to try to compensate for that. And I've done a lot of webinars. But in terms of that really personal connection that you build over a private dinner to talk about all sorts of things about the relationship, I just don't think you can do that virtually.
In a recent conversation, Alastair, that you had with Bain Capital's Jonathan Levine, you've made some news back in Australia about how the firm would handle its recent multi-billion-dollar takeover of Virgin Australia. What is the scope of U.S. investment in Australia now, with Bain Capital as one example?
So the US is our single largest foreign direct investor. And the US is also our single largest destination for FDI. And then when you add the respective trade flows, this is by far our most important economic relationship globally. Interestingly, the US Studies Centre in Australia has just released a report about these very flows less than a month ago. And it said that the cumulative value of American investment in Australia, in Australian dollar terms, is around about $1 trillion. So it's about a quarter of all FDI. And the US contributed $130 billion to the Australian economy last year, which is 7%. So after the US, our next highest foreign direct investor is the UK with $700 billion, or around 70%. And then surprisingly, Belgium with $350 million. China's investment in Australia is only $80 billion, or 8% of US investment. So I think, what's happening is that you're seeing increased Asian investment, particularly from Hong Kong and China, in percentage terms, but frankly, it's dwarfed by the stock of investment from our traditional allies. And also Australia is introducing a more rigorous approval framework to ensure that future investments don't compromise our national security. I guess what that means to me is that in practical terms, investment from the United States will be even more important to Australia than ever before.
Help us understand, because the flow of capital goes both ways, Alastair, where most of the Australian investment in the United States is focused. We know, for instance, Rupert Murdoch has an estimated fortune of $17.5 billion, much of it made from his operations in New York and LA. But where else is Australia really putting its money in the United States?
Well, Australia invests here in two distinct ways. First of all, as you mentioned, the Australian companies. There are many large Australian companies with significant investments here, and these established either organically or by acquisition. So Lendlease, Pratt Industries, BlueScope, CSL, Atlassian, and James Hardie, but there's dozens of other examples. And Anthony Pratt has invested billions of dollars in recycling plants right across the United States. And this is his biggest market by far. Then you've got research collaborations between Australian American universities, which are really extensive, and I've come to understand this in my role. And there's commercialisation spin-offs in technology, cybersecurity, space, defence, agriculture, and medicine. But the other thing is that over the last 30 years, Australia has developed a very large and sophisticated retirement savings system. So this is the fourth largest pool of retirement savings in the world in absolute terms, from an economy that's smaller than the state of Texas. And we also have a large sovereign wealth fund called the Future Fund, which is sort of internationally recognised for its high corporate governance, standards and investment performance. So for your listeners, in a normal working year, Australians contribute compulsorily 9.5% of their incomes to their retirement savings. So when you take this 9.5% and then you add on investment performance, it's pretty clear that the retirement pool is growing at a far faster rate than the Australian economy. And also, asset allocators want to see good international diversification. So increasingly, these funds are being managed by institutional investors in New York and more broadly in the US. And a good example outside New York is, on a webinar I recently interviewed my good Texan friend Ross Perot Jr. He is managing over $1 billion for Australia's Future Fund out of Texas. Then you've got IFM, which is an Australian infrastructure fund, which has made huge investments here, like the Indiana Toll Road, Global Terminals, which manages the container terminals in New York and New Jersey and Vancouver in Canada. And then you've got Buckeye, a major petroleum platform that was acquired last year. So the report that I referenced earlier, Josh, about the size of the investment of the United States in Australia also looked at the other way. And in Australian dollar terms, the investment by Australia is $850 billion. So 85% of the value of American investments in Australia from a country of 25 million people. That's quite remarkable. So the next highest investment destination for Australians is the UK with $500 billion. And then lastly, if you look at Australia's investments in China, only $85 billion. So really only 10% of what Australians invest in the United States.
So if you are not Pratt or Rupert Murdoch, or you have the wherewithal of Ross Perot Jr. to know where to put the money, and you have armies of lawyers, accountants, and PR firms on retainer, what role does the consulate fill in finding investment opportunities for maybe the next level or two levels down of Australian investors? And is that where your banking and advisory experience most intersects with your post?
Yeah, as you said, look, most large Australian companies will work with a number of investment banks or consulting firms to look at acquisition opportunities here. So our role with them tends to be limited, although I do get briefings from time to time on that. But I talk to a lot of Australian entrepreneurs who are seeking venture capital here. And we've had a really great program of meeting and identifying and having VCs for dinners, understanding what they want, having one-on-one meetings so that when our entrepreneurs come here, we can then say, I just had a great meeting with that VC fund. They're kind of looking in your space. So in that area below the large corporates, we've actually had a very, very major role. And our entrepreneurs and founders programs being one of our signature initiatives. The other thing is that you mentioned my role in Houston, and that falls to an organisation called Austrade, and that's the agency responsible for helping Americans look at investments in Australia, because part of my role is also to work with Austrade. I'm not formally part of Austrade in New York, but obviously I was in Houston. And only a few months ago, I was due to travel down to Australia with a major studio investor about opportunities back in Australia. But unfortunately, COVID impacted that. But it's kind of a good example of the way I work with my Austrade colleagues to do that. So we're sort of we look at flows both ways.
You mentioned your Columbia Business School buddy, Mr. Gorman, a few minutes ago. You know, James has his eyes and ears on the ground of not only finance, but politics. There's as much discussion about, who the next Treasury Secretary may be up in New York as there certainly is down in Washington. So how else do you serve as the eyes and ears of the Australian government, not only on Main Street, but on Wall Street?
We facilitate, as you said, about 15 to 20 official Australian visits here. That's obviously pre-COVID. So we've had the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, and a wide range of cabinet ministers, and they all want to meet leading investment and corporate leaders. So in order to achieve that for them, I've had to effectively build my own extensive business networks here across a whole lot of key business sectors. And I run with a guy called Jack Peed, who also went to Harvard, who runs our business investment outreach. For example, I've hosted Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer of Australia, numerous times in New York, including a memorable bell ringing with the NYSE, which made the front pages of the papers back home. And in fact, I've also rang the opening and closing bell of the NYSE for Australia Day, which kind of underscores that sort of great relationship. But we also have a formal body called the Investment Advisory Group, which comprises 25 senior finance executives that I invite to participate. I'm the chairman of the IAG. We meet twice a year, and we have a formal presentation by these participants to Australia's Treasury Department representatives and also the Reserve Bank of Australia attendees. So, for example, your Vice Chairman, John Tuttle, is a member of the IAG, as are representatives of Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, Blackstone, Barclays, Rabobank, and Goldman Sachs. We cover the field there, but we also look at different aspects of the financial markets, such as their components. What's happening with digital currencies? What's happening with gold? What's happening with agriculture here? Industrials, technology, and the like. So there's the formal mechanism and the informal mechanism, but we are very much across what's happening on Wall Street and Main Street.
So, Alastair, whoever finds himself in the White House next January, there are a growing number of Australian entrepreneurs in the US who may not be quite ready to have that meeting with John Tuttle to talk about listing on the New York Stock Exchange, but are looking to tap into the private markets. Is the E3 visa a critical component in fostering a global exchange of businesses and ideas?
Absolutely. You know, the E3 is absolutely a critical component of the economic relationship between Australia and the United States. Now, given how few there are, I'm sure most of your listeners are saying, what is an E3?
That was my next question, Alastair. What is an E3?
Well, it was negotiated during the free trade agreement between Australia and the United States. And it's a visa which is only issued to Australians. So Australia is the only country in the world that has its own visa category here. And it's really been absolutely fundamental to the development of our business and entrepreneurial class, both in New York, but right across the states. I mean, there are literally thousands of Australians who've been able to get a start here in the US because of the E3 visa. And I talk to them, and really importantly, they employ a lot of Americans. So the Australian entrepreneurs here are a big employer of American talent. It's been in existence now for nearly 20 years. And I think it's been through countless White House administrations, etc. People are always worried about the status of the E3, will it continue, etc. But sort of my view is that given the weight and importance of Australia's relationship with the United States and the big bipartisan group, Friends in Australia in the Congress, for their support of the E3, I really can't imagine there'll be any change to the E3, irrespective of who's in the White House after November.
Now, the connection between the US and Australia goes far deeper than just modern politics and economics, the development of the E3. Alastair, really traces back to the battlefields of World War I. What is the history of the special relationship between the USA and Australia?
This is actually a remarkable story. In World War I, we were blessed with an extraordinary wartime leader called General Sir John Monash. And he was clearly the most innovative general in terms of the application of military strategy on the Western Front, which, as you know, was bogged down in trench warfare for years. And he led the charge on the town of La Hamel. And this battle was the first time in American history that your soldiers, American soldiers, had ever fought under a foreign commander. And in their honour, General Monash set the battle for the 4th of July, 1918, which of course is American Independence Day. The battle only lasted 93 minutes, but it was an incredible success in terms of the application of firepower. And after this, Monash went on to win a number of really decisive battles, which rapidly brought World War I to a conclusion. He had over 200,000 men in his command, including 50,000 Americans. So Monash received a knighthood from King George V, but also received the Distinguished Service Medal for the United States for his role in the war. Now, since that time, and this is something I'm really proud of, Australia is the only country in the world to have fought alongside America in every single major conflict that you've been involved with since. This includes the Battle of the Pacific from 1942, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So without doubt, for the last 100 years, Australia has been the United States' longest, strongest, and most reliable ally. And we call this special relationship mateship. And when we rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, we had the mateship banners everywhere because that's the unique relationship between Aussies and Americans.
And Alastair, mateship also has economic components. I think 2 years ago, the first US-made F-35 Lightning IIs right off the assembly line from Lockheed Martin, which is NYSE ticker symbol LMT, were delivered to the Royal Australian Air Force, which was part of an initial order of 72 planes, maybe with another 28 on a back order. A lot of economics and politics in the largest Air Force acquisition in Australia's history. This is also very much a business relationship in addition to mateship.
Well, the two are intertwined. First of all, I've, as the Consul-General in Houston, had the pleasure to actually see the F-35s being built at the Lockheed factory there. So that was one of those things, sort of money can't buy experiences. But Australia has what is called interoperability with the United States military. So all of our military software, etc., is effectively the same software that the United States uses. And there are some examples where, for example, the Boeing Growler, which is a highly sophisticated plane, which is designed for jamming. There's only one country in the world that America has agreed to sell it to, and that's Australia. Now, we've also, in 2016, we had a white paper, defence white paper, which then established the largest increase in our naval history, where with submarines being built in France, but using American software. And just most recently, the government's announced, because of changing geopolitical issues in the Asia Pacific, another major increase in military expenditure. Now, we spend billions of dollars every year buying US equipment, but more importantly, for example, there are 500 Australian servicemen and women embedded in US bases right across the US. That's the sort of thing you see when you come to this job that you have no idea about.
Right.
So that relationship isn't just a matter of history. It's living and breathing today. In fact, the relationship is getting closer and closer and closer than ever before.
I mean, you mark that relationship so often, or at least help us understand it. April 25th, Australians and New Zealanders celebrate ANZAC Day, a national day of remembrance for soldiers lost, and it has gatherings, church services, marches really around the world. How does the consulate normally celebrate the day, and how did you have to compensate this year? Well, again, for your listeners, ANZAC Day is kind of like a combination Memorial Day and Veterans Day for Americans. If you put those things into one day, that's what you'd have. And back home, from the smallest country town to the largest cities, there's a dawn service for ANZAC Day. It commences at 4:30 a.m. And expatriate Australians, you said, we hold similar services all around the world at a similar time. But when I was appointed here, I also wanted to have a church service that recognised the special military relationship and bond between Australia, New Zealand and the United States, forged over the last 100 years. We talked about that. Now, frankly, inviting Americans to a 4:30 a.m. service is a tad early. So what we did was we went to Trinity Church, Wall Street, and said we'd like to have an ANZAC Day service and bring in the American community there. And so they agreed to that. But we've had also the support of Annapolis and West Point. So we have cadets and midshipmen from both the United States Military Academy and the Naval Academy perform the honour guard. The other thing that I did was, following the service, we have a lunch. And each year we raise over $1 million for the American Australian Veterans Scholarship Fund, which funds American veterans to study in Australia and Australian veterans to study in the United States. I know you had a storied career on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, the firm you founded as well. And I'm sure that as remuneration goes, being Consul General is not what being a partner at GS is, but seems like this is one of the best jobs in the world.
Yes, I think it is, but I think importantly also, particularly for New York and also for techs, which are very business orientated, you need to have a good business background. I think coming here I think a foreign policy person would work very well in DC, for example. But I think coming here with a level of business background I had and the contacts I had, my relationship with Columbia University was very, very important. You know, it's also allowed me to make incredible new friends. I remember I was at the naval yards at Brooklyn, and they were taking me around, and I said, "What is that?" And it was Steiner Studios, right? Which you probably know has just announced a major expansion in New York, $350 million investment. So I said to my staff, I want to meet whoever owns Steiner Studios. I had no idea. So they organised a meeting with Doug Steiner. And Doug Steiner said afterwards, you know, he was expecting a very formal, frumpy foreign policy person. And instead he got a businessman that talked about his business, etc. So Doug took me around the studios for like 3 hours, and we become really good friends. Like I and my fiancée Berry would see Doug once a week at least in Brooklyn. So that's just a good example where the perception of what you are and the reality, the business background sort of helps enormously. I think for me, this is the pinnacle job. And it's something that I've always wanted, actually, to be the Consul-General in New York since '88, which I can talk to later on about my career. And so I sort of felt that the chance of becoming Consul-General, just by way of background, since 1987, when I was finished at Columbia Business School, to now, there's only been 8 Consul-Generals. So the chance of becoming a Consul-General here is virtually infinitesimal. So I wanted to make every single hour count and every single day count, which we were doing pre-COVID. So I love the job, and I love representing Australia, and I love America. So it's kind of a natural fit.
Kind of a natural fit indeed. After the break, Alastair J.M. Walton, Consul-General of Australia to New York, and I will discuss the career that led here and what will come next for him. That's all right after this.
We started with a vision to transform energy markets, using technology to boost transparency and level the playing field. That vision and customer focus continues to drive how we look at opportunities and challenges in our industry. Today, we connect participants around the world so they can trade, hedge, invest, and raise capital. We establish prices across asset classes and create opportunity to solve complex global problems. We provide pricing that markets rely on, transform the way business is done, help companies grow to fuel innovation, and provide data to advance economies and society while we invest in our communities. 20 years ago, we saw an opportunity to create a market driven by customer needs. Today, our markets create endless opportunity for participants around the world, and our team is focused more than ever before to ensure the markets continue to function properly. On behalf of my colleagues around the globe, thank you from Intercontinental Exchange.
Welcome back. Before the break, Alastair J.M. Walton, the Consul-General of Australia to New York, and I were discussing the impact that COVID-19 has had on the consulate and the impact that the Consul-General has had on Australia's relationship with the United States. Alastair, your father, Tom Walton, was a senior trade commissioner who was posted all over the globe. How did he and his career influence your decision to enter government service?
I think he had an enormous influence on my career as a whole, not just that of government service. My father was an Englishman from a poor family, but nevertheless he got an honours degree from the London School of Economics. At the same time, he got sporting blues in cricket, tennis and soccer. On top of that, he spoke several languages, as did my mother, and was an accomplished pianist. So, whatever I look at what I've achieved in my life, it sort of pales into insignificance compared with my father. So in the 60s, Dad was a foreign exec with Ford Motor Company, and he was posted to Australia for several years and was due to be sent by Ford to Ford Japan and then head office in Dearborn. But he decided to remain in Australia and to become an Australian and applied to become an Australian Trade Commissioner. And in this diplomatic role, worked all over the world, including Bangkok, Los Angeles, Jakarta, Seoul, and finally Milan as Consul-General and Senior Trade Commissioner. So I guess my childhood was spent living all over the world, and as a consequence, my own career took a similar turn. I knew that one day I wanted to replicate my father's service to his country, and again, the specifics of that really changed when I was invited into the then the official residence of the Australian Consul-General in New York in 1988, and I said, I want to be an Australian Consul-General. That's one of those remarkable things that I owe so much to my father, both his inspiration for the MBA, his inspiration to give service to government, and in fact, the fact that I can live all over the world, I can pick up my suitcase I'm doing now, move somewhere completely new, and sort of pick up the pieces and network and meet people. That's really due to him.
What are some of those memories of places like Jakarta at that time? I mean, you must have been a wide-eyed kid to see all these different cultures, even before he took you aside and said, Alastair, young man, you'll become an MBA. But first, you were just sort of a globe-trotting, gallivanting young man, be able to see capitals and cultures that none of us really get to see, except if you're watching Mel Gibson in Year of Living Dangerously.
Well, it actually was a bit like that living in Indonesia. So my dad's first posting was Thailand, where he was a senior trade commissioner in 1967, and it was during the Vietnam War. And I was at best an indifferent student. My mother would probably say a lot worse than a indifferent student. And also there were drug problems at the American school in Bangkok during that time. Not now, but at that time it was. So all of a sudden, having had this great life in Thailand, I suddenly found myself packed on a plane to go to a Melbourne boarding school, and I was a boarder for 6 years there. But what I would do is I'd visit my parents all over the world 3 to 4 times a year and spend a lot of time with them on university holidays. So I'm applying to Columbia Business School, and the application form says, please list all your summer jobs and what you've learned from that experience. And so I sort of wrote truthfully that summer jobs for foreigners were illegal in Indonesia. Clearly, the admissions, for the admissions committee, that was fine for them. It's great living all the world, seeing different cultures, and also makes you much more open-minded about things. But it also makes you recognise the strengths of your own countries, America, United States, Europe, great democracies. It's really brought that home to me.
You got your MBA from Columbia and joined First Boston, which is now part of Credit Suisse, just a few months before the 1987 crash. In the US, October 19th was known as Black Friday. In Australia and New Zealand, it goes by Black Tuesday because it was already October 20th. The markets were down there by over 40% in a single day. What were your first few months in business like against that kind of backdrop?
I still remember to this day. I mean, first of all, by way of a backdrop, not only had most Australians not heard of an MBA, the Australian banks had neither. So I couldn't get what would be regarded as a student loan here. So I managed to borrow 30 years ago $30,000 from a hire purchase lender at the interest rate of 30%. And so imagine the sort of equivalent today, and it's going to double every 3 years. So I was certainly intent on paying it back. And I got an offer in 87 from First Boston, which then was the most prestigious firm on Wall Street. And I was in the industrials group working on a convertible bond offering from Alcan Aluminum in Montreal when the market crashed. And I can still remember the surreal nature of that day, where first of all, it didn't take long to figure out there was going to be no convertible bond offering. But then we just watched the second half of the day where the markets just completely melted. So it's made me actually a fairly conservative investor overall. I probably have too much cash because I live with those days. And also, a lot of good people lost their jobs. It was a very stressful time to be a young banker on Wall Street. But on the other hand, the leading firms are very small by today's standards. So I was kind of a jack of all trade corporate financier. Did IPOs, mergers, bond offerings, convertibles, and even defeasances. So you got a very, very broad education. And then what happened was in 89, I was called down to the FIG department to meet the partner, Richard Thornburg. And I had no idea what the meeting was about. And Dick said, we want to go to New Zealand to pitch for the privatisation of the Bank of New Zealand. And I said, but I work in the industrials group and I know nothing about financial services. Why me? He goes, you're an Australian, it'll help with the pitch. That was how small Wall Street was then, right? So I thought it was completely crazy. So we go to New Zealand and then we win the business. And so for 2 years, I commuted between New York and New Zealand and then became a FIG banker for the rest of my career. So, I was pretty petrified of Dick Thornburg, talking about the early days. Dick was very demanding and I was terrified of him. But he became a great friend. I moved to Australia to run the FIG business in Australia, having done the work in New Zealand. I actually did some work in Texas as well. And then I moved to London to run FIG for EMEA. And then ultimately I became head of Asian investment bank for the Credit Suisse group. But right behind every single move, promotion I made, Dick was the puppet master. So it was a relationship that in those very, very early tough days sort of paid my way as I got more and more senior. So, I worked in Tokyo, New York, Melbourne, Sydney, London, and Hong Kong for 14 years before going to work for Goldman in Australia. But it was a very, very interesting time to be a young banker then.
After 14 years with Dick and Credit Suisse, you now, and all these different postings, you moved back home, in effect, to Australia with Goldman Sachs. The early 2000s was a prosperous time for the country with significant foreign investment and interest. How did the Australian economy change as the global markets became increasingly connected?
Well, Australia's been blessed with some remarkably good political reformers, of which Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, John Howard and Peter Costello are the gold standard, not only domestically, but in my view, globally. And they both come from different sides of politics, but they both passionately believed in the reform process. So this quartet was responsible for floating the Australian dollar, ensuring the independence of the Reserve Bank of Australia, establishing Australia's internationally recognised pension system, opening up the economy to foreign competition by largely eliminating tariffs, starting the Future Fund, paying down all government debt, which then laid the groundwork for almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth. And that growth would have continued but for COVID. So the work that they did has laid the foundations, not just in the 2000s, but up to 2020. So it's really a golden era of public policy reform. And Peter has now retired from politics, but he is now the chairman of the Australia's Future Fund, which he actually established. Now, when Peter left politics, he worked with me in my investment bank, BKK Partners, with a number of other Goldman executives. And believe you me, he was one of the smartest people that I've ever worked with. So we were very fortunate to have courageous and thoughtful leaders who could sell an economic reform package, right? Selling economic reform is pretty hard, but the pace at which they did this was quite incredible. And I think the Australian people sort of got to expect the fact that good governance meant good reform. So we owe an enormous amount to those four heroes, in my view.
Before you were involved in founding BKK Partners, Alastair, with two fellow Goldman Sachs alums, you were chairman of Central Rand Gold. Does your experience running a public company continue to pay dividends today as you advise and work closely with business leaders and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so look, after working for 20 years with Credit Suisse and Goldman Sachs, I actually retired in 2006 and moved to Italy with my family. I wanted to become a Renaissance man, an Italian.
Don't we all?
Yeah, well, I did it. I moved there. I took the family there, and I wanted to study art in the native language. I thought this would be a beautiful way of living, dolce vitae.
Exactly.
So I did 4 months of language training at the University of Siena, and at the end of it, I had the worst performance review of my entire life. This lovely lady tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Better your family learn Italian and you go back to business." So my whole dream had sort of come to this abrupt end after 4 months. And in fact, my kids all speak Italian, and my eldest son, Angus, works for the giant Australian property company Lend-Lease in Milan and only speaks Italian during his job. So, that part of it worked well. My part didn't work so well. So I decided that I had to do something a bit different and looked at this opportunity that came up from Australia. It was actually some large Australian investors in the company pre-IPO. And so I spent 2 years commuting between Rome and London, work on the IPO document, and we listed on the main board of the London Stock Exchange. And so despite being an investment banker and having done many, many IPOs myself, what I actually found was, that up the listing when it's your company, it's remarkably stressful. Investment bankers say we've got 5 IPOs coming up, and if this one doesn't work, there's the next one. But when you're the chairman of the company, it's your IPO, there's no plan B. And so that was remarkably interesting and stressful. The other thing is working in South Africa had really serious challenges from a corporate governance perspective. So we brought together a very strong board, most who are far more experienced in gold money than I was, but I was kind of the financial markets expert, so it was a good complementarity there. But really to this day, it's made me very empathetic with the role that chairman and boards play around the development of strategy and corporate governance. And I think it made me a better banker at BKK, sort of saying I've been there through that myself. It's very different being on the other end of it.
In 2015, you ultimately made the shift into diplomatic service, Alastair, when you were named the inaugural Consul-General of Australia in Houston. Why did the government decide a Consul-General was needed down in Texas, and what interested you about that opportunity?
Well, we discussed earlier, Josh, about the importance of foreign capital in Australia and we have a large energy sector. So in fact, Australia is the second largest exporter of LNG in the world after Qatar. And so Houston is the world's energy capital. Companies such as Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and ExxonMobil. Now, while Chevron may be theoretically based in California and ExxonMobil based in Dallas, in effect, most of their operations are in Houston. And these companies have made tens of billions of dollars of investment in Australia. They were the largest foreign direct companies investing in Australia in our history. Also, BHP at the time, its global petroleum business was also headquartered in Houston. So in 2015, Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who I actually knew well, announced he was going to open up the consulate there. And so within several months, I was in discussion with the government about taking up the role. And the other thing that really impressed me was just how big and diverse and how fast growing the Texan economy was. And the state itself has got a larger economy than Australia. So this was a great opportunity. So I think, when I look back at my life, I've had quite a number of lucky breaks, but I think going to Texas was a really turning point in my life. And to say that I love Texas and Texas is an understatement, because it's such a refreshing, can-do, pro-business culture. And I think the other thing about Texas is a real focus on personal business relationships. In some respects in New York, you start doing business first and then people become your friends. That's kind of how it works here. In Texas, it's the other way around. People get to know you. If they like you, they'll do business with you. If they don't, they won't. So that was really interesting. And the day before I flew to Houston, I said goodbye to my parents, and my dad gave me his Australian Trade Commissioner tie, which he'd wore throughout his career. And that was a really sort of special moment. And he was very happy that I became a trade commissioner and a consul-general like him. So I really thought that I was going to go to Texas for 4 years and then go back to Australia to the private sector. But obviously that wasn't to be with my move to New York.
So after a couple of years down there, you moved up to New York as Nick Minchin completed his stint as Consul-General of Australia here in New York. How did the job change for you as the landscape moved from oil wells to skyscrapers?
Look, I think the move to New York was a really big challenge for both Barry and myself. This is a very large global city and everyone's really busy. I think it's much harder to meet corporate leaders here in New York than in Texas. Corporate leaders here are always traveling overseas and frankly have more gatekeepers. On the other hand, I think everyone in New York is a hustler, and so there was a natural fit with my sort of personality type. And there's no doubt that having a Columbia MBA and a Wall Street background with Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse at least got me to those initial meetings, which were critical. And the other thing was, until I came to New York, I actually hadn't realised how important the Australian pension funds had become to the investment banking and investment community. And so I think if you think in sort of classic foreign policy terms, this is called soft power. And I don't think in Australia, the community just understands how highly regarded our pension companies are and the system is in New York. And the CEO of one of Australia's largest superannuation funds, a guy called David Elliott of Host Plus, has become a really good mate of mine. And he said, you're the first person to really understand the soft power implications of this huge pool of capital we talked about later, and also to use it to prosecute in our national interest. So if I ever found it difficult to get a meeting with a fund manager or CEO, a friendly call from an Australian pension fund CEO would normally do the trick. So you have to use all these sort of levers. The other thing was that, we are the interlocutor for the whole Australian business community. And with this outreach I talked about earlier with entrepreneurs, we've literally made hundreds of connections which have resulted in business opportunities. So there's also a huge cultural community outside that. There's Aussie actors, filmmakers, ballet dancers, writers, concert pianists. Even the provost of the new school is an Australian Tim Marshall. So the community, the job here was actually a lot more complex, a lot bigger, a lot more demanding than I had in Texas. And we have a Leader in Business program where I do a fireside chat in front of 120 young Australian entrepreneurs and young leaders. And I've been able to interview James Gorman at Morgan Stanley or IJ Bunga at MasterCard or Josephine Linden from Linden Global Strategies, and to have a sort of a bit like the chat we're having now, about their growing up and their influence, etc.
What advice do you give to your successor, Nick Greiner, as he takes on the ongoing COVID crisis and its pending economic fallout?
Well, look, fortunately, I know Nick Greiner very well. I've known Nick and his partner Caroline for nearly 20 years. So what I would say is that Nick's got really four major attributes. First of all, he did his MBA at Harvard, so he's got his own strong alumni network. Secondly, he was a governor of New South Wales, Australia's largest state. And so I think Nick's got a much better grasp of politics than I do. I think he's going to be able to contribute a lot in that sphere. He's been the chairman himself of a large number of public companies and really understands the business world. And then lastly, Caroline, who I mentioned earlier, she's a devotee of the visual and performing arts. So I think they're a great package for our country. And I think they're the kind of the perfect team to take on what we've done here. And given Nick and Caroline's accomplishments, they certainly don't need any gratuitous advice from me as to how to run the post. But I think they're going to be a very successful couple here.
Well, as we have been on this long journey together, Alastair, and as you prepare to pass the reins, I think we're only left with one question for a young man like you who has accomplished so much and yet still has a lot of miles ahead. What's next for you, sir? Well, by now that you've figured out I'm a rolling stone, I don't like to be anywhere for more than a few years. And Berry's exactly the same. In fact, over dinner a few months ago, we both figured out Berry's in boarding school as well, but her father owned cattle properties all over Australia. They kept moving, and he was a farmer developer. And so we sort of figured out we'd never been anywhere for more than 3 or 4 years in our entire lives without moving. So I think it's fair to say that we're very, very open to moving around what we do next. But I think it's fair to say that I'll be spending a lot of time in the US working on my next business steps. And I want to contribute in every way I can to a strong relationship between Australia and the United States. Don't be surprised if you see Alastair Walton back in a Stetson hat and cowboy boots in the not too distant future. So that's probably a bit of a hint as well. Thank you so much. Best wishes to you and Barry. Can't wait to see you down the trail. Thank you so much, Josh. And again, thank you to the New York Stock Exchange. You've been wonderful, wonderful hosts for not only me, but many Australian government visitors and corporates. And I want to wish you all the best as well. All the best. Well, that is our conversation for this week. Our guest was Alastair J.M. Walton, Consul-General of Australia to New York. If you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a question or a comment you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet at us at IceHousePodcast. Our show is produced by Pete Ash with production assistance from Stephen Romanchik and Ian Wolfe and Ken Abel. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the library of the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.